All right, so let's carry on. Here's a couple of the furniture designs that Eero Saarinen is named for, or famous for, his Tulip Chair that you can see a lot of mid-century interiors still use these tulip chairs. There's a table with the curved form. And, we saw a couple of examples in his buildings of these kinds of curved, almost molded forms. And he got this really working with Charles Eames at Cranbrook. And Eames was a really strong inspiration to Saarinen. Saarinen, was probably an inspiration to Eames. They were both highly, highly talented, along with Charles's, life and business partner, Ray Eames. Click on this. All right, so here is a photo of Charles and Ray Eames. And they become this they meet in Cranbrook. They get married in 1941. They move to Southern California, and they really become a huge part, very successful design firm. They do some architecture, but they're really more known even today for their furniture designs and their interiors and so forth. But they're highly talented, and they're really a big part of the sort of mid-century modern aesthetic that's really popular. It's got a huge resurgence of late, that sort of aesthetic. But they did design their own house. This is in Santa Monica from 1948, and really shows their own interpretation of modernist architecture. And it's an experimental house for them as well. So they really are working to, try different materials here, try different aesthetics, just like, almost every other architect's house that we've been talking about the last couple weeks or so. It has a steel and glass enclosure. So it's rooted in a bit of the sort of Miesian modernist aesthetic, international style aesthetic, but they use bold colors, which they were not averse to. So they sort of picking up a little bit of the Bauhaus colors, especially kind of Mondrian color scheme. There were Dutch architects doing these sort of bright, bold primary colors as well. Garrett Redfield, we don't talk about him. We don't have time to talk about him, but he uses these bright gold colors a lot in the early 20th century. So we see that. On the interior, pretty fascinating. It's a very raw kind of space. We see just the exposed ceiling deck or roof decking. We see trusses that are just exposed, holding up. And again, these are all things that by the 1940s are becoming common structural elements, but they're covered up by most architects. And they're you get a plain white box of an interior, and the Eames are like, hey, let's celebrate the structure. Let's make that part of the aesthetic of the space, and let's not just cover it and pretend that it doesn't exist. So, it's going almost back to the Sullivan mantra of form follows function, and really expressing the structure and the structural system of the architecture, but even taking that a step beyond and expressing that directly so that you see it and you understand how this building is put together. Here's a historic view of that. You see some of their furniture designs. And it's kind of, again, it's also a new way of living. This is a house, big plate glass windows. You can do that because you can start to get air conditioning, and so you can have more air-conditioned spaces that are hermetically sealed, but you've got floating planes of artwork and design. I haven't been to this. This is open for tours, and I haven't been able to do that yet, but it's another item on my list next time I get down to Southern California. But you see this a lot in, mid-century modern publications or vistas, big open living space with, here's a very famous Eames designed lounge chair or office chair, and just a casual way of living that becomes very popular in the War era. And some of their chairs, this is actually from the Cranbrook Museum. When I was there, they had an exhibition of Eames furniture, and you can see some of this is a famous fiberglass molded chair. I actually have one in my office here. You can see some of the other ones. These were used a lot in schools, or at least knockoffs of these. Because they're relatively cheap to make. They're formed. They're meant to be more formed to the body's anatomy and so forth. So they're supposed to be more comfortable. Certainly more comfortable than, say, a Frank Lloyd Wright chair, which he never intended to be something that you could be comfortable in. Ray would experiment with fiberglass, which was a new material, with plywood, which was a new material. Plywood became really common during World War II, and you can steam it and mold it, plywood, as well as, of course, molding fiberglass as well. And so we start to see these really molded forms and shapes because you can do that with these different materials. And you still buy this stuff, not inexpensive from Design Within Reach. Most people say design not in reach, but there's knockoffs too, and of course these are now antiques. The originals are antiques that you can buy at antique stores and auctions and so forth. All right, so let's talk about the second Chicago school. So we talked about the Chicago School of Architecture that emerged in the 1880s with architects like Burnham and Root, Adler and Sullivan, Holabird and Roche. And then they really created both an aesthetic for this new type of construction known as the high-rise or the skyscraper, but also the aesthetic of Louis Sullivan's form ever follows function idea, the idea of expressing the structural grid of a building, and in some cases limiting the ornamentation, or at least creating an ornament that was inspired by nature and not by some ancient European architecture, something that would be reflective of its time, reflective of the modern way of building and this idea of high rise. And so, and it inspired architects across America and inspired them in Europe. And it kind of comes around full circle with the arrival of Mies van der Rohe in the late 1930s to Chicago. And he inspires a whole new sort of next generation of that original Chicago school that scholars now call the second Chicago school. And this is an image of the Dirksen Courthouse in Chicago, designed by Mies van der Rohe, before the post office was complete. So this is really kind of talking about what I just said, which you can read, but it's really because Mies immigrates to America. He gets a job as the director of design at IIT, which is essentially a new college. It emerges out of the old Armour Institute, but they rename it in the late 30s, and they call it the Illinois Institute of Technology, and it's really going to focus on engineering and architecture as its primary focus. And they hire this well-known, famous, European architect to come and lead its architectural program. That alone would have been a big deal, but they're essentially starting from scratch. They're going to grow. The GI Bill after World War II means there's a lot of students that can now afford college because the veterans who fought in World War II are basically their college education could be paid for as kind of a way of thanking them for their service. And so colleges all across the country are expanding, and that includes IIT. And so Mies, as the director of the design, they say, well, how about you design our campus for us as well? And so it gets basically a blank slate to create his new vision of what architecture ought to be. And out of his work at IIT, and especially his teaching there, comes firms like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, or SOM, C.F. Murphy Associates, Harry Weiss Associates, Eero Saarinen. They don't all study under Mies, but he becomes such an important influence that all of these firms have a direct influence and tie back to Mies and to IIT. So here he is again. We talked about him a little bit before. This is him standing behind one of his great masterpieces, Crown Hall, the model of that, which is the architecture building at IIT. And it's, like I said, it's his master plan and its construction and expansion of IIT that really helps create this new movement of architecture, this Miesian aesthetic, and the second Chicago school. And it's as important as the influence that Frank Lloyd Wright had in the early 20th century. So here is sort of an axonometric view showing Mies's campus plan. Not all of it was completed the way he had envisioned. In fact, some of the original Armor Institute building, which you can see from the Dan Ryan Expressway, that big giant red brick building, he had envisioned to tear that down. That was located right here. This building here was meant to be the new building, administration building, but they never tore down the old one, thankfully, frankly. And a couple of the other buildings. State Street, so Dan Ryan as Lee runs now right along here. Of course, IIT was planned before the Dan Ryan Expressway was. State Street would be right along here, and was actually filled with, this was part of the Bronzeville neighborhood, and there were still a lot of commercial storefronts and developments. The IIT campus really represents an early form of urban renewal, which we'll talk a little bit about in our next lecture, but or a couple lectures from now. The idea of, taking economically depressed, i.e. slum neighborhoods, and bulldozing them and building new architecture, and that's going to revitalize the neighborhood. It didn't usually work out that way. We'll talk about that, as I say, in a couple of lectures. Especially in an area like Bronzeville, it actually had a gentrification element that was pretty negative, because this was the Black metropolis. This is the African American neighborhood during the housing segregation era, when Black people could only live in certain neighborhoods in the city, and this was part of that. And IIT had, in a way, the best of intentions. They wanted to revitalize this neighborhood, and at that era, the way you did that was to wipe everything out and rebuild. And they thought that it would help be a big draw and would help revitalize the neighborhood. In the end, these sorts of things really hurt the neighborhood and actually contributed more to urban poverty and despair, especially in minority communities, because for lots of reasons. Like I said, we'll talk more about the urban renewal issues in a couple of lectures, but this is a part of that, and an early example of that. But on the contrast, we also get the IIT campus by Mies van der Rohe, which not everybody loves. It's not an enduring aesthetic to many people, but it is a really, really important one. Here's a model that he created of the campus design, and especially in his early design aesthetic here, which was brick, steel, and glass. And very much a Bauhaus kind of campus system, with buildings that would be individually placed in the landscape, that would sort of slide past one another and create sort of courtyards that would sort of ebb and flow around the buildings, actually, and to create interesting spaces rather than one giant quadrangle, which we saw with the example of Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia. That had been the sort of planning concept for college campuses ever since the University of Virginia. And Mies at IIT breaks that. He basically blows that idea up, and he creates campuses that are more randomly generated, and you create niche spaces off to the sides and around buildings rather than just one giant space. So here is one of the buildings, I forget which one actually, but an early IIT building designed by Mies, and you can see here he's expressing the steel construction. He expresses that as exposed, rather than covering it up with masonry or any other material. And then he infills with this sort of yellow brick and then big giant windows. Very much an international style aesthetic that he's bringing with him from Europe, and finally has actually a huge opportunity to implement. Here's a detail of that. The corner details are considered to be masterpieces here. They're really quite graceful. Mies could have just put a square column on the corner and have them run into each other. But look how he reveals this a little bit. You get a really beautiful shadow lines and almost sculptural element here on the corner. And even look at there's even a little reveal where the brick comes up to the edge before it ties into the steel here. These are the kind of little details that Mies was a master of, but the people who copied him often ignored, right? And the clients said, you make it simpler, make it easier. I want a cheaper building. And so Mies is sometimes denigrated because, because the people who came after him or tried to copy him weren't as masterful as he was and didn't have this level of detail and quality. And so modernism gets a bad rap, and often deservedly so, because it became very cheap and very plain. But when Mies was doing it, and when other great architects like Saarinen or whatever, it could be really beautifully detailed and beautiful in sculptural even. So the other great building at Crown Hall, or at IIT campus, is Crown Hall, designed in 1956. This was meant to be the School of Architecture, and he already is sort of breaking out of his earlier tradition from the late 40s of the steel and brick and glass, and he just makes this a steel and glass building. He'd had an idea to do a steel and glass building all the way back in the early 1920s. I showed you an example a couple of lectures ago, but there was no way to do that back then. I mean, you needed air conditioning, you needed good sealant, you needed, all kinds of things technologically to come together to be able to produce steel and glass building like this. And by the 1950s, all those technologies exist, albeit still pretty simple. This is not an easy building to maintain. I worked on the exterior restoration of this, and there were still a lot of problems with this building that had to be solved, and make this a complicated building for sure, including how to heat and cool this building. It's not easy to do. But the aesthetic is here, and of course over the decades after this, now we've really mastered the idea of creating steel and glass buildings. And he also wanted to create a building that is something he called a universal space. And he believed that a modern building ought to have a space that is completely devoid of structural elements, so that you, the user, can do anything you need or want there. And he called that his universal space. And so if it's an architecture school, you can set up your studios however you need to. If it's a factory building, you can set up your equipment however you need to. If it's an office, you can set up, all your office cubicles however you need to, so on and so forth. But to do that, you can't have a whole grid of columns, breaking up the spaces, or have load-bearing partition walls or something like that. And so you see that he uses these massive steel girders that span across the roof. This is what supports the roof. And so on the interior, it is completely devoid of columns. And he expresses the structural system very frankly for the viewer. You see these giant girders. They're not hidden away or buried into the roof structure or something like that. They're very clearly exposed. And this almost has almost a bridge-like aesthetic to it. So here we see a little different angle. You can see the giant girders up here. There's another one down here. And you can start to see on the interior, there are no columns inside at all. And then just a really plain, white travertine marble, and a little bit of a steel frame for the porch. There weren't even handrails in the original construction I worked on the porch restoration as well, and we had to put the rails back on for sure, and we even had to get some variances because there's not there's just wide openings. You know, you can't have an opening more than 3 inches wide on a handrail nowadays because people, a little child could fall through. We were able to argue that this isn't really tall enough for someone to be seriously injured, and it's a college campus. There aren't too many babies and toddlers running around here, so we were able to get a dispensation for that. But even these handrails were an add-on that Mies want to have on his pure aesthetic here. The other thing he does is he creates these frosted glass windows down at the bottom to provide some to provide light, but not the distractions for the students. So when you're in the drafting studios, you can see out the clear story windows, and you can see the trees around you when it had trees. The campus has not been well maintained, the landscape itself. But you weren't distracted during class and so forth because of the sandblasted glass windows here. So here's an interior view I took when I was working on the restoration. And I love this because you see the plain, simple space. Just a slab of a floor, beautiful terrazzo floor slab, essentially a slab of a ceiling plane that is actually held short of the perimeter walls. So it feels like it's floating in the space, no columns. And then, you know, story windows, and you can see out to the trees around it, and then you get these incredible shadows of the trees and the foliage on the sandblasted windows down below. It's a really cool space. If you've never been, you really should check it out sometime. If you're thinking about, you know, transferring into an architecture program, I know a lot of the Triton students go to IIT. It's a very good school, and you know, this is the space that you'd be working in. Normally, it's not empty like this. It's filled, you know, to the brim with drafting studios and supplies and computers and things like that. But this is a rare moment when you can see it in its just raw, pure form like this. And here's a photo of Mies speaking to students at IIT. There's actually quite a diverse student body. Even in these early years, you can see a woman sitting there. There were minority students at the time. You know, there were a lot of the early, you know, mid-century architects that were women and minorities came out of the IIT program. They were very open, and Mies was pretty open to that idea. You know, which was not common, you know, in the 1950s. You know, architecture and engineering weren't for women, you know, and minorities were left out of a lot of opportunities. And IIT was open to that, to their credit. All right, I think this is a good place to stop for the day. We'll pick up a little bit more on Mies and then some of the architects that were influenced by Mies and some of their work on this second Chicago school and this Miesian aesthetic.